We are taking our afternoon break now, Lou, and we just had several witnesses back to back there, a couple of paramedics or EMTs, if you will, and then obviously the fire department. What are your thoughts on what we saw since lunch break?
Well, you know, the firefighter there was not really quite as interesting. He was there in his role as an emergency responder trained with EMT, and he performed life-saving measures. But I found the witness before him to be extremely interesting. I mean, you saw like he was very nervous, right? Very nervous. And he was kind of this stoic, blunt kind of guy. But then you heard he kind of delivered the goods for the prosecution. Well, and then it seemed as though the defense got up to cross-examine and then kind of bailed out of that very quickly. I think maybe thinking that they weren't going to get what they needed out of that particular witness. And I have so many questions that I'm hoping you'll ask the experts, or I'll jump in too, because I'm curious about perception with the jury. Because, like you said, that young man was super nervous, and I'm wondering how that comes across to the jurors, who are the ones ultimately deciding this case. Okay, well, let's bring in Mary Moriarty. She is the former chief public defender in Hennepin County. Mary, first give us your initial thoughts there on the witnesses, especially Derek Smith.
The paramedics were pretty helpful to the state, I think, because they both established that for all intents and purposes, George Floyd was dead. In fact, you saw a picture of Derek Smith going over and taking a pulse, which wasn't there. George Floyd had no pulse, and it was at the same time that Derek Chauvin's knee was still on George Floyd's neck. He also described trying to save George Floyd. They put him in the ambulance. He was asystolic, and so, they could not charge, or, you know, like you see on TV. Right. They could not electrically charge his heart because there was no electricity going through his heart. At one point, they did charge it, but it didn't help. And so I think the takeaway is that George Floyd was, as a layperson would think, was dead. Even at the time he's lying on the ground with Chauvin's knee on his neck. Okay, well, let's take a listen to, that's exactly how Mr. Smith phrased it. Let's take a listen back at a little bit of his testimony as he's being questioned by the prosecution.
And did you take some initial steps, like checking for a pulse?
I checked for a pulse.
And did you also check the individual, Mr. Floyd's, pupils?
I did.
And what did you determine at that point?
They were large, dilated.
So you determined that his pupils were large and dilated. What about a pulse?
I did not palpate a pulse.
And when you say palpate, is that you didn't feel or detect a pulse?
I did not detect a pulse.
And what did his condition appear to be to you overall?
In lay terms, I thought he was dead.
So there was Mary. Again, as Rena was mentioning earlier, how do you think the jury receives this witness, you know, both in terms of the content of what he gave and his demeanor and how he presented it?
You know, it's hard to say about his demeanor. I was just looking at Twitter, and some people were saying he looked nervous. Some people were saying he looked disdainful of everything, and people were interpreting it in different ways. Some people were interpreting it as he was upset because here was this person that could have been saved. You know, there was a sort of tense exchange there where the defense was trying to say something about the fact that Derek Smith wanted his partner, his paramedic partner, to begin compressions. And actually at the time, Officer Lane, who was in the ambulance, was giving compressions. I'm not sure what the defense was getting at, but the response they got from Derek Smith was anybody from MPD could do compressions, which also kind of led me back to thinking, since George Floyd had no pulse, wasn't breathing, was essentially dead at the time the police were on him, when Katie Hansen was there, the firefighter who was trying to get him help, if they had allowed her to intervene, would that have saved George Floyd's life?
And Mary, talk to us a little bit. We've been talking about the jury perception here, and it doesn't matter what any of us think of any of these witnesses. It only matters what the jury thinks. But one of the things that I've been struck by anyway is it seems like the state has all these lawyers, and then of course there's Eric Nelson for the defense. I assume that is purposeful.
It is, and remember, as we've actually been told by the Police Federation, it's not just Eric Nelson. Eric Nelson is the face of the case, so he is doing the work in the courtroom, but we've certainly been told by the Police Federation that they have other lawyers helping him. But yes, you can certainly argue that too, that the state has all of these resources, and I've seen that argument, I've done that argument in a closing argument. Look at all the people, look at all the resources, and here we are all by ourselves trying to defend ourselves against the state. So yes, that is probably a strategy on the part of defense to show that they are the underdog in this case because of the extensive resources the state has put into it.
And Mary, we just listened to a member of the Minneapolis Fire Department, Captain Jeremy Norton, testify. What did you take from his testimony, and what did each side get from it?
I was trying to think through the relevance of that. It could just be, sometimes jurors wonder why witnesses are missing, and it could just be that the state is trying to put together each step of the chain. But there's another way of looking at this too. If you'll recall, the initial report that MPD sent out was that George Floyd died of a medical emergency, and so there was some type of cover-up there in terms of what the original police officers were saying. They weren't talking about what actually happened, and what you heard Captain Norton say was that he reported this to his superiors because it appeared that a man was killed, I think he said, in the custody of MPD. A firefighter, an off-duty firefighter, was a witness to it, and he wanted to make sure that not only the fire department knew about it, but anyone else that might be appropriate knew about it. So this might be part of the beginning of testimony about what exactly did the police officers say in their reports? What did that sergeant say in his report, the sergeant that was called by the 911 dispatcher, who was the first witness we heard?
Mary, it seemed to me like that was exactly why they had him up there. They talked about how they even sent someone back to go find the off-duty firefighter that was on the scene because she was a witness to someone being killed in police custody, as he said. So it feels like they're trying to establish the case that other people on the scene, even firefighters and EMTs, felt like that was exactly what happened.
And the state is building a really effective case for that. It struck me now, after seeing many videos I didn't even know existed, that so many people who were just happening to be there took videos of this. The 911 operator thought this was so strange that there was something wrong that she took it upon herself to call a sergeant to talk about the use of force. You've got the off-duty firefighter, Hanson, who sees something terribly wrong. You've got the paramedics. One thing that did strike me about the first paramedic's testimony is that when he was trying to get Mr. Floyd onto the gurney, he was very gentle in, cradling Mr. Floyd's head because he said he was completely limp. But if you look at the video before that, he actually has to move Chauvin's knee and get Chauvin to move off of George Floyd so that they can actually put him on the gurney, even though essentially we now know he was dead because he had no pulse and he was in full cardiac arrest.
Great observations. Thank you so much, Mary Moriarty. Now let's bring in Rachel Paulos. She's a University of St. Thomas law professor as well as former U.S. attorney here in the state of Minnesota. Rachel, what were your key observations from the testimony we saw after the lunch break?
I think with today's testimony, the state is building a pretty consistent record that every other professional, every other employee of the government who observed what was happening the day Mr. Floyd was killed believed that they were seeing something unusual. And so that really goes to the state's case on unreasonable force. So fairly consistently, starting with the 911 operator, going through the off-duty firefighter, to both the paramedics as well as Mr. Norton, this firefighter supervisor, everyone is saying that they were troubled by what they saw, that they believed they were seeing something unusual, and depending on how forcefully they said it, it is still a consistent picture of concern from other professionals. Sure. who have no vested interest, of course, in spinning the picture one way or the other. In fact, if anything, would be more likely to support other government employees.
Okay, yeah. And during cross-examination of Derek Smith, who was a paramedic who was one of the first responders there, it seemed that Eric Nelson was trying to get something from him and didn't get the answer he was looking for. Let's take a listen back at that portion of the testimony, and then we'll talk about that a little bit.
Officers in the back doing chest compressions, you're getting set up, correct?
Yes, sir.
You went to the second location so that your partner could get back in the back with you to take over for the officer, right?
Not to take over. We needed everybody we could at that time.
Okay. Why didn't you just have the officer help you continue so you could go straight to the hospital?
That's not what we do.
Is it because he's not an EMT?
Any layperson can do chest compressions. There's no reason Minneapolis couldn't have started chest compressions.
That's not my question. My question is, he's not an EMT, correct?
I don't know the level of certification of the individual that got into the back of my rig.
All right. You wanted a partner who could help you out, correct?
I wanted as many people that were willing to help me at that time to work this cardiac arrest.
All right. And that's why fire came, right?
Correct.
And ultimately, the officer was kind of put out of the rig.
Correct.
Now, his wording there, Rachel, there's no reason Minneapolis couldn't have started chest compressions. How did you take that when you heard it?
Oh, I thought the tone definitely shifted there, although there had been subtle hints of that throughout. Mr. Smith's testimony saying that this was a human being. I wanted to give him a second chance at life. I was trying to get the officer out of the way so I could do my job. It was clear to him when he arrived on the scene that Mr. Floyd was already dead, and he just wanted to get him out of there with his partner to try to resuscitate him. But with that sort of turn of questioning, it became clear that Mr. Smith is suggesting that the police were in the way and that they were not being helpful, and that they could have rendered life-saving treatment if they had chosen to do so before the ambulance or the firefighters arrived.